Welcome to the Dublin Bible Talks, midweek Bible talks for workers in Dublin. I'm Cameron Jones. It's a battle of wills, two minds, two opinions, but only one path. Whose will is stronger is the question that will determine the victor. But what happens if one of those wills is God's? And please consider joining us live on Wednesdays from your workplace, 1 p.m. Dublin Time on Zoom. It's a simple way of identifying as a Christian in your workplace. Simply use the link bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. That's bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. Friends, have you ever felt the ache of a clash between two powerful wills? Between maybe your will and someone else's, a boss who blocks all of your plans, a partner who won't budge on a particular issue, a child who defies you, or maybe it's you who's digging your heels in. There's two minds, two hearts, but only one path. If only someone would just give in. But what if the most significant clash of wills isn't between you and another person? What if the deepest conflict in life is between your will and God's will? From toddler tantrums to international standoffs, human history is marked by competing desires. Jesus' own brother James, he puts it very starkly in his letter. In James chapter 4, verse 1, he writes, "What causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you?" These warring passions flow from our struggle against God. His will is good, but our will resists his goodness. Friends, notice this. As we talk about this, we're not talking about some kind of a moral gap that we humans have. The problem that we have is not that we're not quite good enough. No, the problem is that the problem is not of breaking God's rules. The problem is that we reject God as our ruler. It's an issue of rebellion. But God, in his goodness, has not left the world to spiral in this chaos of competing egos. No, God has a clear will, a clear purpose in history. Remember what Jesus said to his disciples after his resurrection? Matthew 28, Jesus said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." If you are ever wondering what God's will for your life is, isn't that something that Christians often wonder? What is God's will for my life? Let me tell you what it is. Are you listening? God's will for your life is that he rules over it. And that's not just his will for Christians, it's not just his will for churches, but it is God's will for Jesus to reign over every aspect of life and everything in heaven and on earth. Do you see the contest of will that's going on when people resist Jesus? In resisting God's anointed king, they are resisting the will of God himself. And it doesn't matter how polite they are about it, or how confident they are about it, or whether they are genuinely hostile. It doesn't always look dramatic, but it is always real. Psalm 2 unveils the reality. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed one. But that's not just about ancient kings. It's about us. It's about today. Because the will of God is still the same. The will of God is still the same as Psalm 2 verse 12, "Kiss the Son, and blessed are all who take refuge in him." That is God's loving command. That is the path of blessing, but it requires surrender to God's King. The news of the gospel is that God doesn't leave us to harden in our rebellion. He calls us, rebels, to change sides, to stop resisting and start rejoicing in the rule of Christ. By his Spirit, he can even turn the most stubborn hearts to willingly bow their knee. He did it for Saul of Tarsus. He does it still. But not all Saul-like figures change, which brings us back in history to another Saul. In 1 Samuel, we've been following the slow but unstoppable rise of God's chosen king, David. Anointed by Samuel, filled with God's Spirit, empowered to slay the Philistine Goliath, God's will is very clear: David will be king. But Saul, the current king, will not let go. Oh, initially he was warm to David, but then he grows fearful, and then angry, and then murderous. Saul's will is set. He will cling to his throne. He will not bow to God's plan. Now, Saul never says, "I'm rebelling against God." But that is what he's doing. Consciously or not, he rages against the Lord and his anointed one. That, friends, is the context of 1 Samuel chapter 19. David, God's chosen king, is under threat. Saul wants him dead. And yet, as we will see, the Lord delivers David again and again. In this chapter, there are 4 remarkable escape stories, and each one of them exposes a truth about God's unstoppable will and humanity's futile resistance. And this is not just history, it is a mirror. Because the question isn't just, what did Saul do? The question is, are we doing the same? Is there a part of your life where you are resisting the rule of Christ? Is there some corner that you want to keep under your own control? Some situation where you act as if Jesus was not Lord? You might not think about it as rebellion, but the Bible does. So as we step into 1 Samuel 19, let's pay close attention. Let's ask what happens when human wills set themselves against God's will. How does God respond? And how can we learn to take refuge in God's anointed king? Well, today we're going to look at the first 2 episodes in the chapter, and the coming session we'll look at the remaining 2. First, the prince who took sides, chapter 19, verses 1 to 7. Jonathan comes back into view. Last time we saw Jonathan was back in the beginning of the last chapter, verses 1 to 4. He's done something extraordinary in the beginning of the last chapter. Jonathan had seen in David what no one else had seen. He'd committed himself to David, heart and soul. He'd made a private covenant. He'd made a public stripping of royal robes. It was a moment of deep loyalty and quiet revolution. But now that loyalty is about to be tested. There's no pretense happening anymore with Saul. And in verse 1, we see Saul's fury breaks into the open. And Saul spoke to Jonathan, do you see that there, his son? And to all his servants, that they should kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David. Until now, Saul's efforts to destroy David have been hidden. They've been behind closed doors. Thrown spears, shady marriage schemes, manipulation, all behind closed doors. But now it's out in public. He issues a death sentence in front of his household. Even Jonathan is summoned. Why does he summon his son? Well, that's because he is Saul's son. Did you notice the narrator makes sure that we notice? He uses that phrase 2 times. His son. Saul expects family loyalty. He assumes that his son will help him keep power. But Saul has misjudged his son, Jonathan. Back in chapter 18, verse 2, we were told what's really driving Saul and his actions. Saul was afraid of David because he knew the Lord was with him, but he had departed from Saul. In chapter 18, verse 15, he was in fearful awe of David. Saul sees David's growing popularity, sees David's success in battle, and he's afraid. The crown is slipping from his head, so he lashes out And so he gathers his court and he demands that David be killed. And by doing so, he's not just threatening a man, he is setting himself against the Lord and against his anointed one. This is not just palace politics we're seeing here. This is a rebellion against God himself, setting himself against God's will. But in the second half of verse 1, we're told that Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David. The word delighted, it sounds like a gentle word, but it's very weighty. It's not just fondness. This is a covenantal loyalty. Back in chapter 18, verses 3 and 4, Jonathan had made a covenant with David. He's even given David his robe and his sword, even his right to the throne. Jonathan recognized what his father didn't, that the Lord was with David. And that delight, that commitment, now determines Jonathan's actions. Saul may be his father and on the throne, but David is God's chosen king. Now, it's just worth pausing there and seeing that there is a challenge for us in this. I mean, what do you do when your natural loyalties clash with your loyalty to Christ? When family, friends, career tug in one direction, but the will of the Lord is set in another. Yes, friends, God is sovereign even over your career, over any ambition. Jonathan shows us we must choose the king of God's own choosing. Verses 2 and 3, we have a warning. Jonathan moves immediately to protect David. Jonathan told David, you see it in verse 2, Saul, my father, seeks to kill you. Therefore be on your guard in the morning. Stay in a secret place and hide yourself. And I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where you are, and I will speak to my father about you. And if I learn anything, I will tell you. Notice how many times Jonathan says, my father. 3 times in 2 verses. Jonathan knows the cost of what he's doing. Jonathan isn't warning David about a distant threat. He's warning him about his own father's murderous plot. This is loyalty tested, and there is no middle way. It's personal. Sure, it's painful. But Jonathan will not stay silent. He steps in, not just to warn David, but to act as a mediator. The way he says it in verse 3 has an emphasis, as if he's saying, I, yes, I, will go and stand beside my father. And this will happen near where David is hiding, where David can see with his own eyes before hearing Jonathan's report back to him. Verses 4 and 5, we find that Jonathan is a man of his word. And he clearly prepares for speaking with his father, and he gives what is, I think, one of the most remarkable speeches in this whole book. Beginning in verse 4, and Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul, his father, and said to him, let not the king sin against his servant David, because he has not sinned against you, and because his deeds have brought good to you. For he took his life in his hand, and he struck down the Philistine. And the Lord worked a great salvation for all Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood by killing David without cause? Here Jonathan calls sin what it really is. He gently, respectfully but truthfully, gently but directly. He reminds Saul of David's innocence, of David's courage, of the day the Lord used David to save Israel. He even appeals to Saul's own memory. You saw it, he says, and rejoiced. There's real gospel wisdom here, friends. Maybe something for when our friends say something against Jesus, something that they don't know but we know is dangerous to them, such as using Jesus' name as a swear word. Our confrontation of that must be truthful, but it must also be gracious. Jonathan doesn't berate his father, he reasons with him. He appeals to his better instincts. He tries to draw Saul back from the edge. And this time, remarkably, it works. Saul listens. Verses 6 and 7 Well, first of all, look at verse 6. Saul listened to the voice of Jonathan. Saul swore, "As the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death." Saul swears an oath. David is safe for now. Oh, but we know Saul. We've watched his spiral. He's volatile and he's unstable. But in this little respite, we see a little image of the will of God being expressed in history. David is spared, Jonathan is faithful, and for a brief time the king relents. Verse 7, and Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as before. But things can't really go back to how they were. The trust is broken, the threat remains. David is still God's chosen one, and Saul is still resisting. But the will of God proceeds. The Lord preserved his anointed king. So the question is not whether God's will be done, but whether we will gladly submit to it, like Jonathan does, or whether we will resist it, like Saul does. As we get to verse 8, we don't know how much time's passed. It's days, weeks, probably not very long. Peace doesn't last long in Saul's house or in Israel. Verse 8, there's war again. And David went out and fought with the Philistines and struck them a great blow, so that they fled before him. Once again, it is David who leads the charge and David who triumphs. The Philistines, Israel's long-time enemies, they're routed. God's people are saved. David has been doing this ever since Goliath fell. It's his God-given calling to serve the Lord's people, and Saul knows it. And so the victory brings tension again. David's success fuels Saul's insecurity. The very things that should bring Saul peace, having a champion like David, actually ignites his rage. Verse 9, then a harmful spirit from the Lord came upon Saul as he sat in his house with his spear in his hand, and David was playing the lyre, and Saul sought to pin David to the wall with the spear. The scene is loaded. Saul seated, gripping his spear, David soothing him with music. Do you notice the contrast there? Saul holding a weapon, David holding an instrument of praise. But as before, the spirit of a harmful rage comes over Saul. It's the third time that 1 Samuel has spoken of a harmful or an evil spirit from the Lord affecting Saul. It's a judgment, a sign that God's spirit has departed from Saul, and Saul is given over to his own malice. Saul is much like Pharaoh in Exodus 4 verse 21. God's judgment takes the form of handing a person over to their own hardened heart. I'm reading through Romans this month with a group of men, and this morning we read that this handing over is what happens to all humanity as a part of God's judgment of us for rebellion. In Romans 1 verse 24 and then 26 and then verse 28. Therefore God gave them over to the lusts of their hearts, to impurity, to the dishonouring of their bodies among themselves. And then again in verse 26, for this reason God gave them up to dishonourable passions. Verse 28, since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them over to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. The tragedy in this account in 1 Samuel is doubled, because Saul is not just plotting murder, he's breaking his own word, his own promise, his own oath, given just verses ago in verse 6. He'd said, as the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death. Now David's done nothing to provoke this reversal. Quite the opposite. He's once again delivered Israel from the enemies. But here is Saul, spear in hand, again trying to murder the one who's just saved him. God's anointed is under attack again. In the second half of verse 10, we read David eluded Saul so that he struck the spear into the wall, and David fled and escaped that night. David eludes the spear. Saul strikes the wall and David runs. And this is the very last time that David will ever be in Saul's presence by his own initiative. From this point on, David is a fugitive. He is a hunted man. The narrator shows an ironic reversal in this little passage. Back in verse 8, we read, David went out and fought the Philistines and struck them with a great blow, so that they fled before him. You notice in verse 10, Saul tries to strike David, and David flees from Saul. That same language is used both David's defeat of the Philistines and Saul's attempt to destroy David. In this we see that Saul has become a Philistine in his actions. He has made himself an enemy of God's anointed king. Now, as we finish, let's pause and reflect on those two little escape stories of David, the first two in this chapter. And we're going to consider just four things quickly. First, just consider the contrast between Saul and Jonathan. Both of them stand to lose everything if David becomes king. Both are observing David's rise, but they are responding in two radically different ways. Jonathan loved David and delighted in him. Saul feared David and tried to kill him. The same polarized reactions greeted Jesus when he took on flesh, and they remain today attitudes to the risen and ascended Jesus. Some see Jesus as a threat to their autonomy, a threat to their power, a threat to their pride, whereas others see his goodness and his grace and his mercy and find delight in him. Friends, where do you stand? Do you see Christ's reign as a threat to your own rule, or as your only hope? Second, something about the irrationality of sin is something we see in this passage. I mean, Saul knew David was innocent. Jonathan made that plain to him back in verse 4. And even knowing that, Saul seeks to kill him. Why? Because goodness itself has become a threat to Saul. And it was the same with Jesus. Pilate knew Jesus was innocent. The crowds and the religious authorities, they'd seen his power, and yet envy drove them to cry out for his death. And it makes us think, or it should make us think, are there ways in which we resist Christ, not because he is unworthy, but precisely because his goodness exposes our pride? Third, there's something in this of the joy of those who truly love the king. I mean, we're not told how Jonathan felt when David struck down the Philistines, but given what we know of him, there's no doubt that he rejoiced. Real love for the Lord's anointed delights in his glory, not ours. A Christian heart says, he must increase, I must decrease. Do you notice? Do you rejoice when Christ is honoured, even when it humbles you? Finally, notice in this the foolishness of resisting God's king. In this passage, we see Saul's attempt fail twice, and it will keep failing as we go through this chapter, because God is preserving his king. God's will is going ahead as he plans. You see, the spear of Saul misses, but the Lord's purpose do not miss. And that means to set yourself against Christ is not only wicked, it is deeply foolish. It will not succeed. The only place resisting the Lord's anointed will lead is to ruin. So don't resist him, run to him and rejoice. In the story of Saul's spear, we see more than a violent king. set sometime 3,000 years ago in history. No, we see also a warning. We see a pattern. We see a choice. And the question is, do you stand with Jesus or do you stand against him? Because only one king is truly unstoppable. Only one will. And that reality, recognizing that reality, reveals true wisdom or true foolishness. It allows us to see the real status before God of our neighbours and our colleagues and our friends. Oh, friends, don't they need to become like Jonathan and turn away from being like Saul? In the words of Psalm 2, don't they need to kiss the Son or he will be angry, and their way will lead to destruction? For his wrath can flare up in a moment. But blessed are all who take refuge in him. Thank you for listening to the recording of the Dublin Bible Talks. You can join us in real time on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Dublin Time on Zoom, bit.ly/Dublin Bible Talks. That's bit.ly/Dublin Bible Talks.